The Tarkin Doctrine is an important concept in Star Wars, but it's one which often gets misunderstood among fans, or at least understood in a more limited or incomplete context. Essentially, people take the Tarkin Doctrine, also referred to as the Doctrine of Fear, to be about having the biggest ships possible, doing as much shooting as possible, but this isn't strictly correct. We'll get into the underlying ideas of the Tarkin Doctrine, but we have at least a few sources for what the doctrine was formulated out of, between Legends and canon. In Legends, we have commentary by Tarkin on it in the Imperial Handbook, but even better than that, in the Imperial Sourcebook, we got the explicit text of the communique between Tarkin and Palpatine, which formed the basis of the doctrine. In canon, a similar address by Tarkin exists in the novel Tarkin by James Luceno, which is a bit less specific, but operates on at least some similar underlying principles. This is of course because the core philosophy all of this is based on is stated outright by Tarkin in A New Hope, and James Luceno was also one of the bigger and more important Star Wars authors during Star Wars Legends, with Tarkin being one of the first canon books, so there's a lot of overlap at that point between the two different continuities. So I think this is one of the things where anything you say about one continuity fairly equally applies to the other. We're going to focus on the Legends side of it though. The Legends version has a few elements preceding the core of the rule through fear element, focusing on ways to increase coordination of Imperial forces. One is through the creation of over-sectors, allowing more pooled resources to deal with problem worlds, and greater authority by Imperial officials to root out seditious elements without being impacted by sector borders or other interplanetary relations and power structures which would interfere with such operations during the Republic. These kinds of parochial interests get referred to by Tarkin as part of the rot at the heart of the Republic. Secondly, Tarkin suggested the Galactic Holonet be nationalized and put under control of the Imperial Navy, allowing much faster communication and coordination, while also preventing its access for unauthorized use. As Han Solo points out in the notations in the Imperial Handbook, the black market was still full of transceivers, so the latter element of this section wasn't the most successful. But the most important element, the one which people are familiar with and which relates to things like Star Destroyers and the Death Stars, is the rule through fear. As important as those three words are, though, they are not the entire sentence. There's equally important words which come right after them. The full sentence is the rule through fear of force rather than force itself. Tarkin acknowledges that conventional warfare has existed for a long damn time, so people are fundamentally aware of how to blow up a soldier or a vehicle or a ship. They may have a numerical advantage in the Empire, but they can't afford to get drawn into a long-term war against united enemies, saying it would be years before a force significant enough to subjugate every world simultaneously could be built. Instead, they need to deal with individual enemy cells before they can coalesce and before they can give any impression of united front. Importantly, for reasons we'll get to, once you start a full-out war of this kind against something like the Rebellion, it's almost impossible to win. So Tarkin outlines a fairly simple idea for an operation in this direction, quote, "If we use our strength wisely, we shall cow thousands of worlds which might otherwise consider rebellion to some degree. We can do this through superior coordination and manipulation of information. For example, over-sector groups could coordinate to make a series of devastating attacks upon known planets of resistance, taking care to eliminate any fleeing vessels capable of making hyperspace. The operation would take several days in order to jump to all suspect planets in the area of operation. After the operation, we could report to the media that a single over-sector group conducted a single-day operation without specifying the day, which was successful, eliminating resistance on each of the worlds included in the operation. Granting the citizens the impression of an overwhelming force, one against which resistance would be futile, would certainly reduce the chance of a citizen fostering such resistance," end quote. So basically, you're hoping to use force in a limited way where nobody ever really has the opportunity to actually check your capability to use that force on a wider scale, and where the hope of fighting them just seems gone from the get-go. The demonstrations of force are a double-edged sword, though, which we'll get to with our discussion of the Death Star in a minute. Tarkin specifically calls out the size of the Star Destroyer as being one of its greatest strengths. It's not that it's actually impregnable, it's that the Empire is at its greatest strength when nobody is trying to fight it. Once you're actually in a situation where the margins of in-battle effectiveness of the weapons becomes important, the Empire has already kind of lost, because they'd be fighting a forever war. The rebellion couldn't really be defeated because there was always going to be a rebellion. It may not be the rebellion with Mon Mothma and Akbar and the Skywalker twins, but there would always be someone, somewhere, opposing the Empire, which the Empire would have to contend with, and to some extent, this would mean fighting against their own weapons, which means the better the weapons are. The rebellion was formed and led by former Imperial commanders and politicians or other soldiers who defected after all. The Empire, on the other hand, was very much interested in shaping its own policy around its own specific continued existence with its specific institutions and specific members. Obviously, each member of the rebellion would hope it was their iteration which would succeed, but we're talking from the Imperial perspective here. The final culmination of the Tarkin Doctrine was, of course, the Death Star. If the Star Destroyer was so big as to prevent opposition from appearing, a giant mobile space station with a super laser was even bigger. You don't need to worry about making a fleet big enough to subjugate and pacify the whole galaxy at once if nobody needs subjugation because they're terrified of your death ball. And again, we have Tarkin's psychological elements at work here, rather than the specifics of military strategy or tactics. Tarkin thinks people won't oppose the Empire because the Death Star is too scary, but this has some limitations in practice. What good is a Death Star against anything less than a full planetary revolt in an actual tactical or strategic sense? Not all that much. We see it used against capital ships in the Battle of Endor, but when the threat is supposed to come from the destruction of a planet, it only works if you seem willing to destroy that planet. But then if you're too willing to destroy too many planets, then that can backfire too. One of the ironies for me, though, is that I always see people talking about how the Tarkin Doctrine didn't work because of the specific weapons, rather than just the fact that the Empire had an expiration date built in when it was formed. And this kind of buys into the Empire's own weapons development propaganda, something we see with pretty much everything that gets developed, whether it's the TIE Defender, the Dark Troopers, or whatever else. It's always one more Wunderwaffen weapon, bro, that'll stop the rebels. But this fundamentally misses the point, and it misses the point in a direction that Tarkin seems to have understood, at least on some level. I've gone into more depth on the specific military elements of this in a prior video about the TIE Defender and Lancer, and claims that those were the real secret to establishing the Empire's forever rule, but when it comes to the doctrine as a whole, and the idea of ruling through fear, Leia said it best, the more they tighten their grip, the more star systems will slip through their fingers. What Alderaan showed us, as much as the dangers of standing up to the Empire, was the risk of falling victim to them no matter what you did. The canon novel Lost Stars, one of my favorites, does a good job of showing how Alderaan, as well as the destruction of the Death Star itself, impacted the way even Imperial service members saw their role in the galaxy. Whether or not Alderaan was a justified target was not a universally accepted thing within even just the Imperial forces. And for the Imperial military to be as big as it needed to be, it relied on even people who were at least somewhat opposed to the Empire being able to join it and do what they were told. We see this with Luke at the start of A New Hope, where he and his friends were all planning to get off of Tatooine by joining the Imperial military. Recruitment of people who were less than fanatical about the Empire or even conscription were necessary to have a military of the size needed by the Empire, but that meant to some extent they were always a recruiting and training ground for the rebellion as well. And if you think about it from that perspective, the imposing nature of the Star Destroyer wasn't just a threat to the rebels, it was a threat to those within the Navy. Maybe you want to defect, but are you going to convince 37,000 of your closest friends on your Star Destroyer crew to leave as well? Probably not. When you're in that situation, how do you get out? That's a big question. But if you're one guy in a hyperspace-capable TIE Defender, things get a little bit easier to bring down to the level of personal decision-making. This can even be true on smaller ships like Lancers. I'm not saying if everything in the Imperial fleet were smaller, they'd have started having every single person defecting, but it's a greater threat proportionally. And that's where the double-edged sword element comes from. This is why one of the crucial elements is that the Empire needs to maintain the fear that force might be applied, rather than showing that they go around blasting everything. The fear of force before it's turned into the application of force makes for a far more effective deterrent, and crucially makes it easier for people to rationalize that the force will also be aimed in a justified, at least in their mind, direction, namely somewhere other than themselves. So in my opinion, having a superweapon they needed to demonstrate the power of in such a way as the destruction of Alderaan was as likely to backfire as to cow people into submission. Think about how nuclear weapons are supposed to deter attacks against a state. The threat is that if the state is attacked, it might use its nuclear weapons. If it builds the nuclear weapons and then starts using them immediately, that only invites the attack more because their existence is no longer a deterrent. They're being used either way. There is no threat here, it is just the fact of them using that force. So if anything, when Tarkin says Dantooine is too remote for an effective demonstration, he's wrong about what he should be trying to do. Dantooine would have been better because it's easier for people to say, oh, that's a remote place, They can blow up a planet though, so that's scary. Instead, blowing up Alderaan raised a lot more questions about how and why the Empire was willing to use this kind of force. Ultimately, that was always going to be at the core of the Tarkin Doctrine. It was never going to be a long-term sustainable strategy, and it's just another reason why the Empire was sort of doomed to fail from the start. That's going to do it for today though. Thank you for watching. Remember to leave a like and subscribe for more if you enjoyed the video, or let me know in the comments if there's another topic you'd like to see me cover in the future.